Hello, welcome to Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened. I'm Hayley Rhodes and I'm here with the man himself.
I'm Fred Dinenage, and that, as they all say, is half an hour, but not just yet. Sorry, old habits die hard.
So we are talking today about a case that you covered when you did the first series of Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook in 2011.
Yes.
So this is the story of Ruth Ellis. She was the last woman in Britain to be hanged. She was hanged for murder in 1955. Why is this a case that has such a familiarity for everybody?
This is an extraordinary case, Hayley, which still resonates very much with a lot of people to this day, particularly women. And I'll tell you how I know this. Just the other day, and this is an absolutely true story, a lady stopped me in the street and said, "Hello, Fred, what are you up to now?" I said, "Well, I'm working on a new series of evil killers for Sky Crime. I do my Ronnie and Reggie theatre tour with the Craze, and I do one or two cruises giving talks as well." And I said, "I'm just about to do a podcast." "Oh," she said, "what's it about?" I said, "It's all about Ruth Ellis." Her whole demeanour changed, and she said, she said, "I'm still angry about Ruth Ellis to this very day. That poor woman should never have been hanged. She was a victim. It's all so wrong." She said, "I can remember it like it was yesterday, and it was all so wrong." So that's how the case of Ruth Ellis still resonates to this day, as it did at the time. You know, when the court case decided that she was going to be hanged, this is long before the days of multimedia and all the rest, and TV channels and social media. Even so, there was a 50,000 signature petition demanding that she be pardoned. And that feeling, as I say, still resonates to this day, which is quite extraordinary.
I can understand that, because the more I've dug into this case, the more that it feels like so much should have been said at the time that wasn't said, and there was so much nuance to this story that probably wasn't reflected in the case at the time.
Yes. I mean, life started, she was a bit of a victim, Ruth Ellis. Mm-hmm. I know she made terrible decisions in her life, but nonetheless, the way she started out her life in a poor sort of working class family in Wales, there was a suggestion which has never really been discussed by anybody, a suggestion she might well have been abused by her father. It's an allegation. So right from the word go, really the chips were set down against this poor girl who aspired to be much more than what she actually was, if you know what I mean.
Many people think that Ruth Ellis is the victim. She's not the victim. She's a cold-blooded killer.
I feel an enormous sympathy for her, because I feel that she was a victim of her time.
As far as the law was concerned, she pulled the trigger, she killed a man in cold blood, and therefore she should be found guilty and hanged.
In 1955, a murder was committed outside this pub at Hampstead in London. The victim was David Blakely, and what made his killing so shocking was that his attacker had been his lover, Ruth Ellis. What I want to know is what would drive a woman to hunt down and kill in cold blood the man that she loved, and just how responsible was she for her actions?
Every version of the story that I've read or seen or watched tells it slightly differently. So when you were making this programme, where did you start, and how did you decide where to start with this?
We started really by talking about Ruth Ellis's early life. Let's go back to Ruth Ellis's childhood, her young life. What sort of life was it?
She was a bit rebellious, a difficult child. She was not academically gifted in any way, and the family tended to move around. I mean, the life of her father really dictated how the family lived. When he was in work, they lived fairly well, and when he wasn't, which was quite a lot of the time, things were very, very difficult.
Very early on in her life, she was only 17, she met a Canadian soldier who professed his love for her. She became pregnant by him and had her son by him. His name was Claire Andre. And of course, he wasn't what he seemed at all. He was married at the time with a family of his own. So he let her down. The first of many men in her life who badly let her down. And that's where we kind of really started the story of Ruth Ellis.
I mean, it feels to me that she was looking for two things. She really wanted to be loved and she wanted security, but she also did want a bit of the high life. She wanted something better than that kind of that upbringing in Wales that had, and then in, I think, Basingstoke, then London, that had been quite unhappy and quite deprived, and, as you say, stories of abuse potentially. And she wanted something more than that, and that's what she was always seeking and kind of grasping for.
Yeah, I mean, she was so attracted to the bright lights of the West End, which in actual fact were the start of her downfall, really, because she met the wrong men, if you like. She was attracted to men, and she was very attractive for men, and she got involved with so many men along the way, so many affairs. So she wasn't a good girl as such, but she may well have become a victim.
Yeah, it seems that maybe she saw men as the tool to get her
exactly
where she wanted to be in life, but in turn they were using her for what they wanted too.
Exactly, yeah. And she married a man called George Ellis, but it was a marriage that was destined to fail, which of course it did, because she kept on being attracted to and attracted by other men.
Yeah, and he seems to have been quite a flawed character too. I think a heavy drinker.
A heavy drinker, yeah, and like a lot of men in Ruth Ellis's life, prone to outbreaks of violence as well. It seems that most of the men she got involved with were prone to violence. Yeah,
it's interesting, and it can't have. I mean, I think it was probably more normal back then than it was now, but it can't have been the norm for all men to have been violent towards their wives. So she clearly was drawn to the wrong men, and the wrong men were drawn to her.
Yes, and she wasn't a prostitute as such, but she was involved with lots of men, and I suspect, money did change hands.
She would have had a real trouble getting a job. So she ended up applying for and getting a job at the Camera Club, which involved her posing naked.
Men used to go down to this club with their cameras. Few had film in them, I ought to say. And she would just disrobe and sit there in a static pose and be photographed by men. And she knew that the movement of her body, the eye contact, her youth, her pertness, could affect men. And I think that was the first time she really, really discovered that she had this control over men.
That was the start of her downward spiral, if you like. That sort of work, getting involved with a lot of men and meeting the wrong men, and eventually becoming manager of a club in London, which, again, she met the wrong men.
I mean, there was sort of various points in her life where it felt like maybe she was attaining what she wanted. So there was the marriage to George Ellis, and I think he was a dentist, so he was a man with prospects. So I guess that was a point where it felt like she might have almost made it, and then he turned out to be violent and a drinker. I think he spent time drying out, didn't he, in kind of rehab type places. And then she became manager at 27 of this club. And
the little club, yes.
The little club, yep. Again, it looked like she might have made it, but things just seemed to keep dragging her back down.
Yeah, this was the little club, I think, was a real drinkers' club, which attracted, obviously, men and very few women. One of the men who went to the club was a racing driver called Mike Hawthorne, very famous racing driver at the time. And he brought into the club one day a chap called David Blakely, who was introduced to Ruth Ellis, and there was an instant attraction between her and Blakely. As it turned out, a fatal attraction.
But looks can be deceiving. Blakely's inability to keep a job and his obsession with motor racing drained his inheritance. His drinking increased. He was soon left penniless. He relied on Ruth to provide him with free booze at her club and also her bed for the night.
It was one of those awful sort of cyclical relationships. Grand passion, great lust, followed by extreme violence, huge makings up, and back on the old treadmill again. Neither of them understood each other or themselves.
That relationship between them is so fascinating because they do seem to have both been drawn to each other, and there was a connection from both sides. But I think she perhaps wanted more commitment from him than he was willing to give.
She did want commitment, and eventually he did. He had other lovers, but he eventually did ask Ruth Ellis to marry him. you know. So, but at the time she was pregnant. They had a row. He kicked her, and she lost the child. So it was always a very, very violent relationship. And she was also involved with another man called Desmond Cusson, who plays an integral role in this whole story.
Here was a man who I think genuinely loved her. He cared for her. Nothing was too much for Cusson where Ruth was concerned. And Ruth really appealed to him. I can imagine why. I mean, again, she was very good looking and she was very kind to him. And he, in turn, was very kind to her. In fact, the only man I suspect in her life, including her father, that treated her like a woman. And but there was Blakely. And Blakely was the excitement and Cusson was the reliability. And at 26, 7 years old, you don't want reliability.
She always had to be the centre of attention. She didn't. And whenever Blakely looked as if he was straying a bit, which he did with monotonous regularity, she would use Desmond Cousins to goad him, you know, to make him jealous.
What was the dynamic with him? I mean, he again it's talked about that he was in love with her, but he also seemed to accept her relationship with David Blakely.
He did. I mean, she was living with Cusson, but having an affair with David Blakely at the same time. And Cusson, it appeared, accepted this and was relatively happy about this. Although I suspect he probably wasn't, and I suspect he had his own plans via Ruth Ellis for David Blakely.
So going back to David Blakely, he was I guess upper class is how we would describe him.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the Murder Casebook program that we did, we looked at Blakely, and he was a higher class, if you like, than Ruth Ellis, and this is something that she always aspired to. She always aspired to bigger and better things, to security, to money, and Blakely appeared. I say appeared because he wasn't all that he appeared to be. He appeared to be rich and successful. Another racing driver like Mike Hawthorne, not a professional driver, but had ambitions to be a professional driver, had ambitions for better things. In the end, I think he blew most of his money on racing cars. And I think in the end, he was more or less reliant on Ruth, amazingly enough, for money, the money she was making at the little club.
Oh yes, and he ran up these bar bills at the little club that he expected her to cover.
Exactly. He would run up these huge bar bills, which somehow Ruth would manage to write off legally or illegally, but that's how much she loved him. So he wasn't what he appeared to be at all, but she was obsessed by him. He's an attractive man.
Alcohol seems to feature so much in the story of Ruth Ellis. For herself, she seemed to drink a lot, and all of the men that she dealt with. Was just the excesses of post-war London? Was this what life was like, or was this unique to their kind of social crowd?
No, I think life was like that, particularly in London, and particularly in that part of London. But I think, the war years were behind, rationing, etc., and suddenly this whole new world opened up. Not always for the better. And eventually, of course, it led to the demise of Ruth Ellis.
She is described at a lot of points along this story. I mean, in Murder Casebook, you speak to Lawrence Marks, and I think that his perception of her is that she's quite calculating all along, really. No matter, she did meet with hardships, but that she was quite calculating. She was driving things forward. But she seems to have had a lot of mental health difficulties. There's a lot of chaos that I don't know if she was in control of. I think there was a point where she visited her husband, George Ellis, in hospital, and then she ended up having to be restrained because she kind of lost the plot, and then she was on tranquilizers that she was prescribed there. So she doesn't seem to have really been in control. Is that your understanding of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think she did have her own mental health issues, unsurprisingly, probably. It's interesting, in that Murder Casebook program, I always had the feeling that Lawrence Marks, who knew such a lot about the story of Ruth Ellis, I always had the feeling he was actually very sympathetic. I really did feel that he felt a certain sympathy for Ruth Ellis, and that she had been mistreated and manipulated. That's the feeling I got. I mean, he was critical of her, but I felt that in a way he felt he could understand her. I interviewed him in the Magdala public house, outside of which Ruth Ellis shot David Blakely. Conversely, Professor David Wilson, the criminologist we interviewed, I always felt he really felt Ruth Ellis had got everything she deserved. To me, it was a fascinating comparison between these two men and the lady we interviewed as well, who'd been around at the time.
Yes, this was Pip Granger.
Pip Granger, another author. Pip, of course, who'd lived through those days, the post-war days. I felt she was really on the side of Ruth Ellis, you know. So that was another aspect of the programme which I found absolutely fascinating. Pip, who was totally sympathetic to Ruth Ellis and could understand the temptations that she'd been attracted to. Lawrence Marks, who, despite all he said, I felt he was sympathetic towards Ruth Ellis. And Professor David Wilson, who I think he felt she deserved everything she got. You know,
yes,
because
I
she
got
had
that
killed a
impression.
man, after all.
Yeah, and you know, that murder is murder,
Yeah.
but there were so many circumstances that I mean, in my opinion, mitigated. And I mean, tell me about the events leading up to the murder of David Blakely.
She was living with Desmond Cusson at the time. She was convinced that Blakely was having an affair with another woman, which is probably true. She couldn't seem to get hold of him. She couldn't find him. He wasn't returning phone calls, etc. She went round to some friends of David Blakely where she was convinced he was. They wouldn't let her in. Then she saw Blakely getting into a car with a friend of his. She and Desmond Cusson, who she was living with at the time, followed him to the Magdala Public House in Hampstead in London. Blakely went in with his friend.
He then paid for his drink, walked out the door over there, outside, and there was Ruth standing with a Smith & Wesson loaded, 6 bullets in the barrel. And she called David. And David looked round and saw Ruth with a gun in her hand.
Blakely's first instinct was to run, but he didn't get far. Ruth pulled the trigger. She fired 2 shots, and then a third that cut him down. Ruth coolly walked up to David's body and emptied 2 more shots into him. Blakely lay dying. With her mission accomplished, she then turned the gun on herself, but the gun jammed.
And the final shot from the gun, in fact, hit the finger of a passerby who actually lost it. And Blakely was on the floor dead, and several people came up, including one man, and Ruth Ellis, in a very confused state, said to him, "I need the law." And he came out with those immortal words, "I am the law, I am a policeman." And Ruth Ellis was arrested, and that was it. But the extraordinary thing I find, again, the way this has resonated, this case over the years, in 2003, the case was referred back to the Court of Appeal by the Criminal Cases Review Commission.
2003. Wow.
Yeah, and it was turned down. In 2007, a petition was then given to the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, again asking for a pardon for Ruth Ellis, signed by thousands of people.
Who was driving this campaign?
Supporters of Ruth Ellis,
Wow.
mainly women, but, you know, very well organised. And Gordon Brown again turned down that particular appeal for a pardon. But it's extraordinary how, until even now, as I say, it still resonates.
People are outraged,
but
yeah, still.
really strong the feeling about Ruth Ellis. You know, even though a convicted murderer, but nonetheless, people thought she shouldn't have been hanged.
I mean, it feels so distant in time to me. It's 70 years ago. But you actually interviewed a man who was a little boy on the day that David Blakely was killed.
Yes, extraordinary. He was coming with his dad. He was 8 years of age, passed the pub, saw the shooting, or the aftermath of the shooting. And to be quite honest, I think it's affected him all of his life. He cannot get that image out of his mind. And it's still, as he explained to us on that Murder Casebook programme, it's still a vivid, vivid memory for him. As indeed is the Magdala Public House for me, because we spent time there with Lawrence Marks. It's intriguing because in the pub wall, there are 2 apparent bullet holes in the wall of the pub. In fact, this was an absolute con.
No way.
Because it is claimed that a previous landlady of the Magdala Public House because this was obviously a bit of a tourist attraction, in fact, somehow scraped out a couple of holes in the wall to make it look like bullet holes. But in fact, absolutely not true at all.
That's brilliant.
Not true at all.
So as well as spending time in the Magdala, you also went with criminologist David Wilson and fired a gun, and that was something you'd never done before.
Yes, he had this interesting man, David Wilson, full of all sorts of unusual experiments and unusual stories, and he told the extraordinary story of the surgeon in this particular programme, a fascinating story. I won't try and do it because he did it so perfectly.
But it was designed to show the kind of gender bias that is embedded in all of us.
Yes.
Even today, and obviously would have been so much more so back in the 1950s.
Yes. In other words, you think of certain people as men. Mm-hmm. A surgeon in this case. Yeah. Most people think a surgeon. Oh, it's going to be a man, but not necessarily at all. And he had this idea. He took me to Bisley, the shooting ranges, the rifle ranges at Bisley. Put a gun in my hand. I'd never held a gun before, similar to the Smith & Wesson that Ruth Ellis used when she killed David Blakely. Showed me a target and said, right, fire a shot at that target and we're going to find out how it feels. So I picked up the gun. I'd never held a gun before. I fired it at the target. By some miracle, I actually managed to hit the target, not on the bullseye, but I did hit the target. And then he said to me, I can remember it now because it's in that film and in the Murder Casebook. And he said to me, how did it feel like to hold the gun? And I said, well, it felt quite heavy, which it did in your hand. In fact, I think I used two hands to hold it. But the trigger was feather light. It was really, the moment you touched it, bang. And he kept on saying, well, what did it feel like when you pulled the trigger? And I probably got a little overexcited, to be quite honest, because it is an extraordinary sensation, and no doubt, Ruth Ellis in a funny sort of way would have had a kind of similar sensation. She'd have pulled the trigger once and then there's the desire to pull it again.
Yeah, I mean, you said I've pulled it once and I wanted to pull it again, which is quite frightening, really.
Yeah, and that probably drove her on as well. I fired one shot, I'm going to fire another.
Yeah, well, once you've crossed that line, why not go again?
Yeah, and so it was extraordinary, and I've never fired a gun since.
No, okay, you did get a
probably just as well. I've become addicted to it.
On the 20th of June 1955, Ruth Ellis stood trial for the murder of David Blakely at the Old Bailey. It was up to Ruth to convince the jury that she didn't know what she was doing when she killed Blakely. But Ruth Ellis was unwilling to play the role of victim.
Ruth had re-dyed her hair platinum blonde to the horror of her solicitors. As she was brought into the courtroom, members of the gallery were shocked, and one was even heard to exclaim, "Tart."
So at the end of this trial, after Ruth Ellis hasn't put up, it's fair to say, much of a defence for her actions, and she actually said on the stand, well, obviously, when I shot him, I intended to kill him. So she hasn't really given the jury anywhere to go, and they were pretty clear in their verdict.
They were. I mean, they could have come up with a verdict of mercy killing, but as I say, Ruth wanted to die. I think she wanted to be hanged, so she made it absolutely easy for them, really, to reach that verdict in a matter of,
14 minutes.
14 minutes.
14 minutes.
Which is ridiculous, isn't it? 14 minutes, because there she was with the blonde hair, dressed the way she was dressed, saying, yes, I'm guilty, I killed him, and what were they to do, really?
Mr. Justice Havers sentenced Ruth to death by hanging. She calmly accepted her fate.
And the judge, in his summing up, which is really interesting, so he sentenced her to death. He felt that he had no option, given the facts of the case, to sentence her to death. And in his summing up, he used a phrase which has become really common parlance legally now, but wasn't back then. This is the first time I think that it was used. He called it a crime of passion.
It was a crime of passion, wasn't it, really? Although how much of it was passion and how much of it was actually coercion, I don't know. I don't know. But yes, it was a crime of passion in a sense, in as much as she was passionate about David Blakely.
Yes, to the point of obsession, I guess.
Yeah, to the point of obsession. But the impact on her family was just Terrible, wasn't it?
It was devastating. I think her mother, Bertha, ended up taking her own life.
Yeah.
Her ex-husband, George, I mean, he had his own problems, so it
George
wasn't
Ellis.
necessarily related to her, but her former husband, George, took his own life.
Correct.
I think eventually her son, Andre, that she'd had with the Canadian serviceman, ended up desecrating her grave and then taking his own life too. So there were these really tragic shockwaves that kind of extended for years.
Absolutely awful. Absolutely awful, the repercussions of Ruth Ellis and what she did. Absolutely horrifying, really.
Do you think that if the roles had been reversed and a man had done to his lover what Ruth Ellis did to David Blakely, do you think that the jury, the judge would you think that the trial would have taken the same course?
I don't think, had a man adopted the same attitude and mannerisms and dress as Ruth Ellis, in other words, had a man said, yes, I'm guilty, I did it, I don't think the judge and the jury would have had any option at all but to convict him at the time of murder and therefore to be hanged. I don't think at the time, given similar circumstances, the verdict could have been any different.
And this obsession that, we say obsession, this obsession that Ruth Ellis had for David Blakely, and she loved him, she had been abused by him, she'd lost a baby because of him. She saw him as her future, but he was never going to be. And then after all this has happened, he's literally ignoring her. He's refusing to answer her calls. He's refusing to come to the door of his friend's house when she knocks. I mean, this build-up of feeling, this, whether it was anger or despair, it feels quite justified on the part of Ruth Ellis.
Well, it wasn't. It was a total obsession, wasn't it? She was obsessed by him. I think she was totally in love with David Blakely. And I think David Blakely was a wrong 'un. And I think he treated her appallingly, physically and mentally. He treated her appallingly and then kind of ignored her, I mean, it's a story that's repeated so often, isn't it, in life, but never usually with such dire consequences and such awful consequences. But yeah, she was obsessed with him and Blakely wasn't what he appeared to be. She was obsessed with an image, I think, of what she thought David Blakely was and should be, and he wasn't.
I think the statistic that's used these days is that when women kill, more than half of them do so because they're killing a partner who has been abusive towards them,
Yes.
who has controlled them, who has physically hurt them. And then the just less than half are the ones who do it for other reasons. I mean, where do you think that Ruth Ellis falls on that spectrum of kind of calculating killer to people who are responding to a provocation, control, abuse?
I think Ruth Ellis actually falls into both categories. I really do. I think she was driven to it, and I think she was badly treated, both mentally and physically, by Blakely. There's no doubt about that. But she falls on the other side as well. She was absolutely obsessed by the man. So I think Ruth Ellis completely falls on both sides of that particular coin.
I actually think that sums up a lot of things that happened in the course of her life. She was horribly treated.
Yeah.
She suffered from a very young age at the hands almost entirely of men. But then she also made quite a lot of poor choices along the way that if she'd have been less keen on the high life, if she'd have not seen this kind of elevated life for herself as being the way out of her troubles, perhaps if she'd just made more small C conservative choices, I wonder whether things would have gone very differently.
I think if Ruth Ellis had made different choices, her life would have been completely different and almost, well, as important, to be honest, the life of her family and her children would have been different as well.
Only a day before her execution, Ruth was persuaded to appeal. She revealed the extent of Desmond Cussen's role in the murder of Blakely. The call was put out from the Home Office to find Cussen.
Cussen must have been in a state of absolute panic. He went into hiding and they never found him, and at midnight they called off the search and Ruth was doomed.
When she came out with the story of Cussen, right at the last minute really, the police made a sort of half-hearted effort to find. They thought, this is interesting, made a half-hearted effort.
Knocked on his door once.
Knocked on his door a couple of times. He wasn't in, so they went away and really forgot all. It was crucial, this, and yet they forgot all about it. Didn't do anything about it at all. And eventually, Cusson went to Australia, never to come back here again. It was extraordinary, really. And yet
so he never got his side of the story, and he died without ever sharing that information.
Absolutely right. Yes, and the other fascinating character we met in that Murder Casebook programme was Baroness Slosh, whose dad was the judge.
Yeah, Lord Justice Havers.
Lord Justice Havers, you see. And she actually said her father had grave misgivings himself about the guilty verdict and the hanging, but he felt he had no option.
Based on the facts of the case as they were presented in court.
Yeah. What was also a complete side issue, which wasn't in the programme, was the Baroness Slosh's brother is Nigel Havers, the actor and television presenter. And I was chatting to her, and she was quite a character. And she said, she said, the whole family have finished up in the legal profession, all with the exception of Nigel. Somehow, he finished up in show business. What a waste. See? So she was fascinating. It was just a fascinating programme to have made about a fascinating woman. And Ruth Ellis was eventually hanged.
At 9 a.m. on the 13th of July 1955, prisoner number 9656 was taken to the gallows. Ruth Ellis was hanged for the murder of David Blakely. She was the last woman in Britain to be put to death.
So she was executed by the famous executioner, Albert Pierpoint.
Yes, she was. And there was an absolute outcry at the time. I mean, outside the prison, there were hundreds of people, mainly women, it has to be said, but nonetheless hundreds of people, very much in support of Ruth Ellis and very much believing that this woman shouldn't have been hanged. But of course, it had such an impact in the long term, in as much, she was the last woman to be hanged. And indeed, with 10 years later, the death penalty itself was scrapped. So she did leave her mark, she did have an impact.
And even a couple of years after her execution, I think the law was changed so that the option of diminished responsibility was there, so that actually you could say, yes, this person killed someone, but were they in their right mind when they did it? Yeah. Which is really important. And what was the other change in the law?
But you're absolutely right. Diminished responsibility. I'm sure she would have got off genuinely and justifiably on those grounds, because she clearly wasn't in the right mind. She was consumed. She'd been badly treated by, all right, you could say she brought it on herself, but she had been badly treated by a lot of men, Blakely included, who'd kicked her in the stomach and cost her a child.
And that miscarriage had actually happened not very long before his murder. Precisely. And there would be an argument in today's understanding of the legal system, there'd be an argument that she actually hormonally and chemically wouldn't have been in her right mind at that point in time, having suffered what she'd suffered.
Yeah, and she'd got mental health issues anyway. And then there is this influence of the man called Desmond Cusson. So I think she would have got off on the grounds of diminished responsibility and would have got a life prison sentence. But that wasn't what she wanted, you see. I think Ruth Ellis, having killed the man she loved, I think Ruth Ellis wanted to die.
And she wrote to David Blakely's mother saying as much, that she was, when she was executed, she would be with him.
Yeah, she would.
Which is interesting, that was all her fixation was on, really.
Yeah, I mean, he was a wrong 'un, Blakely, but, she loved him. She loved him, and it cost him his life, and it eventually cost her her life. But that's what she wanted, but... and there were strong feelings in the press as well. A lot of the newspapers took Ruth Ellis's side and said, no, you shouldn't hang this woman, but she brought it on herself, didn't she?
A lot of it did seem to come down in the moment to class. I mean, you've got the establishment who are all lining up to say, I think it was a police inspector who actually said she saw herself with David Blakely, who was someone several classes above her, and when that couldn't happen, she killed him. So a lot of it did seem to come down to her being perceived as this kind of girl from Rhyl who she was a lower class girl. She'd behaved in a way that good girls don't behave.
Yeah.
And then she'd killed this man who was, I mean, not a pillar of society, but who was socially, I guess, considered superior to her. So, and then, so you've got the establishment all lining up to say this is what she deserves, this is what she's brought on herself. And then you've got 50,000 members of the public signing a petition saying that she shouldn't be hanged. So the public perhaps perceived her plight very differently.
The public liked Ruth Ellis. If you know what I mean. They sympathised with Ruth Ellis, saw her as one of their own, if you like, an ordinary girl, who'd got mixed up in the wrong company and done the wrong thing.
While striving to make a better life for herself.
Yes, but the class thing then was much more, I mean, it still exists today, of course, but it was much more them and us.
Absolutely.
At that time.
And her appearance in court was very much remarked upon, that she dyed her hair peroxide blonde and she dressed in this kind of flashy way like she might have dressed to be a nightclub hostess.
Yeah, and I think she did that on purpose. And I think that was all part of her plan, that if I look like a tart, I'll be treated like one, and I think because she wanted to die. It's a really tragic case, actually, I think.
It is tragic, and I know that it had such long-lasting repercussions for her family in particular that I think all of them, pretty much to a person, I think apart from her sister Muriel, met quite a tragic end. And I think that, I wonder for her children, the fact that she'd made that choice for herself must have really had repercussions for them.
I think no doubt about it. It was a terrible scar for them all to bear, and they never, any of them, I don't think, ever really truthfully got over it.
No, and the attention that it must have brought on them as a family too, because this was such a huge deal at the time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But like Lawrence Marks, I know you shouldn't kill anybody, obviously, but like Lawrence Marks, if I read him correctly in that Murder Casebook programme, I do have a certain sympathy for Ruth Ellis. And I think, had the situation been different, had she been able to plead diminished responsibility, I believe she wouldn't have been hanged. She would have got a life sentence. But I also believe that would have made her desperately unhappy. I think she got what she wanted.
In the UK, the impact of Ruth Ellis's death eventually played a part in changing the legal system.
She changed two laws, really. She contributed hugely to the abolition of capital punishment. The year after she was hanged, the defence of diminished responsibility was put on the statute books because it was obvious to everybody that she was not in her right mind. However calm she might have appeared, she was not in her right mind.
It's a sad story in a way, isn't it?
It is. It is. I've got enormous sympathy for Ruth Ellis because she just didn't have the self-awareness to be able to drag herself out of the mire she'd got herself in. And I think the only way out was to kill herself. And being a good Catholic girl, she couldn't do that, so she let the hangman do it for her.
How do you think this would have been handled differently by the legal system? If this came to trial today with the same circumstances, how do you think it would have been handled differently?
Laura's changed so much, hasn't it? It really has. She would have got a life sentence today. There's no doubt about it. Not more than that. She would have got a life sentence, and probably would have lived to come out of prison. But the law was different then, and Ruth Ellis paid the penalty.
So Desmond Cousins, he was this man who supposedly was madly in love with Ruth Ellis to the extent that, he paid for her accommodation. I mean, there's talk that he even paid for her son to go to school. He put up with, and maybe even encouraged her dalliance with David Blakely. And yet when it came to the trial, he gave evidence against her. I mean, what was going on with Desmond Cousins?
The whole thing is just so utterly bizarre, isn't it? Cusson obviously, in his own way, loved Ruth Ellis, permitted her to carry on her affair with David Blakely, gave her the gun which eventually killed Blakely, drove her to the Magdala public house where Blakely was shot, and yet he was clearly part of the whole thing, but nothing ever happened to him. He testified against Ruth Ellis, and when she told the police about his role in the whole thing, or what was her allegation of his role in the whole thing, nothing really was done about him. He got away absolutely scot-free, did Cusson, and went to live in Australia. How he got away with it, I just don't know. And why? What was his motive? It's very, very hard to explain, isn't it? You know,
it is, because none of it was going to end up with him and Ruth being together.
No.
I mean, I don't think he liked David Blakely, and I think he would have been happy to have seen him dead.
Yeah.
But in which case, did he just use Ruth Ellis as a tool to achieve that?
I think that's the only explanation you can find, because he must have known that in effect, sending out Ruth Ellis to kill David Blakely, Ruth would be caught and dealt with by the authorities. He must have known that. So why would he have done that? Unless it was his way of getting his own back on David Blakely. I can only assume that's what it was. Why else would he have done it? But it was a cruel way to treat Ruth Ellis, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I find myself wondering what the rest of his life looked like after he moved to Australia. I've got quite a burning desire to go down a rabbit hole now.
That's another story, and we shall never know.
If you were to make the Murder Casebook about Ruth Ellis now, what do you think you would do differently? What are the bits that you would perhaps reflect on that you didn't in the first iteration?
I think if we were to make that Murder Casebook programme now, I think we would look perhaps in more detail at Ruth Ellis's early life. And I suppose, on reflection, I might have been more sympathetic to her, because as the years have gone by and I've thought about the case so many times, I think I would have been more sympathetic to her. But basically, I honestly think it was a good programme and a fair programme and an honest programme, and just told the story of not a bad woman, but an unfortunate woman, an unlucky woman. I think the story was told quite well.
I think the people that you spoke to, weren't going to be able to speak to people who knew Ruth Ellis well, but you managed to get as close as you could to actually really getting to the heart of Ruth Ellis and her experience.
I think Lawrence Marks in particular, he'd done so much research on Ruth Ellis and the family and the various associates. I think he really got as close to Ruth Ellis as we could get at the time. I do, honestly, my feeling was that Lawrence Marks was sympathetic towards Ruth Ellis, as indeed, all these years later, am I.
It was a fascinating watch, and actually it made me realise that you can almost never know everything there is to know about Ruth Ellis. It's a story with these tentacles that go in so many different directions.
And I suspect, even now, we've not heard the last of Ruth Ellis.
Agreed. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened. I'm Hayley Rhodes. Thank you very much, Fred.
Been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.